Hello and welcome to the Smart Recovery Podcast, your audio headquarters for inspiring and insightful discussions on the topic of addiction recovery. What you'll hear with us will be self-empowering, science-based, and stigma-free. We believe you have the power within yourself to make changes that will move you toward a more satisfying life. And we hope these messages and interviews with leading addiction experts and advocates will help you believe that too. Remember that the purpose of this podcast is to educate and inform. It is not a substitute for medical care from a doctor or other qualified medical professionals. Before making any changes in your treatment plan, please discuss your thoughts with your medical provider.
Welcome to the Smart Recovery Podcast. This is your host, Luke Frazier. Today we have a person who actually is from our neighbor up north in Canada. His name is Shawn Fisk, and he's a counselor at Serenity House. And he's going to talk to us today about some of the issues that come up in terms of recovery, other than substance use disorder. We might touch on that, of course, but we're going to talk about different things where people struggle and try to use smart recovery principles and practices to address these kinds of negative behaviors. Shawn, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Luke. I'm really excited to be here.
And tell me where Serenity House is.
So Serenity House is in our nation's capital, located in Ottawa, snugged in a nice, quiet residential neighborhood. So although we're what you call congregate living, so we're in that sort of medium-term to long-term living situation. So it's a in-house treatment facility. Men come for about 90 days. And although we're considered sort of under the auspices of the Ontario Health Board, so we're a medical facility, it's actually just a nice cozy house. Gives kind of that feeling of this is the men's home. We get a chance to model prosocial skills, that kind of stuff there, waking up, doing chores, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I have to say I took a peek at the website and it does look like a nice house, one what I wouldn't mind living in, a nice neighborhood. So I certainly saw that. And talk a little bit more about that. It's kind of, you said, prosocial behavior or modeling that. I mean, sometimes treatment centers, for a variety of good reasons, are separate and put out somewhere at a big campus and kind of by itself. Is that, it sounds like it's intentional, but talk a little bit more about why that would be helpful to those who are getting services.
Well, we often find, whether it's any kind of behavior we're trying to work on, substance abuse or not, because I know we will touch on some of those things after, it's found that removing someone from their environment and giving them opportunity to practice and challenge some of their thoughts, behaviors, cravings, and habits, right, our routines, and try to model from top down some, let's say, skill set behaviors that are able to replace old behaviors, thoughts, and feelings. The challenge, and one of the reasons our government up here really challenges the idea of funding this kind of idea, is once you take someone who has even just had a short-term practice of different skills, you plop them back into the same environment they were in, as we know, that becomes difficult. So we like to have our clients, smack dab in the middle of Ottawa. Many of them are from Ottawa. And we like to get them to start to engage in other community activities, building other relationships that are important. So when they do go back to whatever environment they were in, they're able to access these other relationships they've built.
Yeah, that's a great point. And, in down here or a lot of places, there's a idea of a quarter way house or a halfway house or 3/4 way, but it all starts with them having been in a treatment center, residential, more than just a house. Is that true for your guys?
It is, and it's true in our organization. We do have what we call transitional housing, which would be that next step. So what we do at Serenity House is intensive care. So we're talking full-time recovery university. Of course, it's based on CBT and highly based on smart recovery, which is one of the reasons I'm excited to talk to you guys. But and then the transitioning back into regular society for whatever reason. A client may have come from a situation where they're not financially capable to get back on their feet, so we have these transitions, or they may be in a situation where they'd like to re-educate themselves. So we offer stable, accountability-based housing, that will allow them to sort of pick up and move on. I offer to the men that these behaviors, including substance abuse, of course, play a role in their lives. And so part of, even part of what we would look at in terms of the smart recovery I run at the house is how do we replace those behaviors? So rather than just say, I'm going to eliminate my substance use, I'm going to eliminate my overspending, I'm going to eliminate my gambling. Well, it played a role in our lives. And the importance for us is saying, let's look at creating a better future for you by imagining something different. Yeah. So that's kind of what we do.
That's great. Well, you mentioned transitional housing and transitions. So let's pull a transitional podcast moment here and go back to your personal kind of professional background. Tell me, where'd you go to school and what kinds of degrees or certifications do you have?
Well, in my life previously, I was a high-level sport psychology coach, and I spent a lot of time doing that for Combative Sports Canada at the national and international level. And being a competitive athlete myself back then, I fell into the sort of trap, which is sport injury, medicating, over-medicating, and then slowly all of those things in my life faded away as people like myself who are in recovery can remember these things do happen. And so in picking up my pieces, I became heavily involved in the 12-step program and also simultaneously heavily involved in the smart recovery program. So I'm a smart recovery instructor. I was for quite a long time a sponsor as well. And as I started to do those things, I started to volunteer in the same programs at the Cornwall and a small city outside of Ottawa, the Cornwall Community Mental Health and Addiction Building. And I spent a considerable amount of time volunteering there in the same type of groups that I was part of. And so I also, like many, I'd call myself a young man if I can for today. I'm actually 47 years old, but I'll call myself young.
Folks, podcast listeners, he looks a lot younger. I will say that.
Well, thank you. But, as many young men in early recovery do, I had considerable anger and, anxiety, social anxiety, stress issues. So I spent a bunch of time in our fine city of Ottawa at the Ottawa Royal Hospital to learn to manage that. So I started volunteering there as well. And so in doing that, it was suggested to me, why don't I take my skills from being a sports psychology coach, which is, planning, briefing, debriefing, a lot of motivational interviewing. And why don't I consider moving into a career in addiction therapy? So I re-educated myself in early recovery at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario. And one of the first places that I really targeted working, I was in a position like many men in early recovery, I offer to them, this is your opportunity and you get to hit a reset button. And if you get to do that, you get to take informed choices where you take your time. And so I did. And Serenity House was one of the places that I most wanted to work. I was never a client there, although some people that work with us were clients. But it's very much appealed to me and their philosophy. And I bugged the executive director over and over. I was the bubble gum stuck to her shoe until I started there on weekends, and then a cursory evening staff member. And I'm a full-time addiction therapist there. I run group therapy. I run one-on-one solution-focused therapy. And I've been there for 2.5 years. Mm-hmm. And it has been the absolute privilege of my adult life for sure.
Wow. That's a really interesting story. I mean, you have a lot of lived experience. That's a lot of what you're talking about. And then the volunteering aspect, that you wanted to be involved. One great way to begin to learn organizations and learn fields of practice or applying things in a real life situation is by volunteering first. So I applaud you for that. That's really, I don't think that's a usual kind of, it's not unheard of, but I think it's less usual for people to enter the field in that way. So tell me then, in terms of your personal journey, how long you've been sober?
Coming up in 5 years only. So I'm one of those guys that the old school, old timers or old school recovery and mutual aid group members would always tell me, and I'm sure some of them are hearing it now, saying, slow down, son. And I was mindful of those ideas at first, but I've always been a high functioning person. I'm very energetic, and I minded my P's and Q's in early recovery, and things came together quickly for me.
Mm-hmm.
And, it does take a village and a team of people, and I did have that, but ultimately we run under our own steam.
Mm-hmm.
So on December 28th of this year, it'll be 5 years.
Excellent.
So,
Congratulations.
yeah.
Congratulations.
Well, thank you very much.
I know exactly what you're saying about the old timers. I have been in 12-step programs. I'm sober 15 years. And those guys, mostly guys, would say, sit down, and after 5 years, you're just getting started. After 10 years, you're just getting started. And that's a certain kind of shtick, if you will, in my estimation, because what one of my sponsors told me is, you may be attracted to what a person in their first year of recovery is doing and offering and being about in a group setting versus someone who's been sober for 30 years, who's still angry and judgmental and critical. So, it is about the days. I believe that. For in the 12-step program. I've also gone to Smart Recovery, and there's so many great aspects of that. There's not as much focus on uninterrupted time in Smart Recovery. Talk about that as far as your personal journey. Did you have starts and stops with your sobriety?
Well, I guess like a good old school 12-stepper, I sort of was beaten into submission. So when my philosophy, I think, Luke, is that we're all chronic relapsers until we're not. And my feeling when I finally hit the rooms and hit all of that stuff, I was just, for one reason or another, I met all the right people at the right time. And I just was able to gain the resiliency to stop. No, I agree, though. In Smart Recovery, there's not as much focus on uninterrupted time. I'm not much of a time counter because I feel like counting time at some point becomes an obsession in itself and a sort of a badge, and can be. And I worry about those things.
Mm-hmm.
I want to say that recovery is life. So, early on, I heard that we get into recovery to live. We don't live to be in recovery. And I know that that's catchphrasy, and I prefer my own catchphrases, to be honest, than the ones I hear in the rooms.
Yeah.
But I will say that that's an important perspective. So when I finally was willing to look at the dark truths that we all have to face in order to get well, the great psychologist of all time, Carl Jung, would say, look where you don't want to. And I see that over and over, whether it be in my volunteer work, the mutual aid work, private practice, or at Serenity House. I see that over and over, the thing we don't want to look at. And so when I finally had the courage to look at those dark things, that's where freedom was for me. I took a combination approach, though, Luke. I'll tell you that early in recovery, I'm a studious person. I've been university educated before, and all that led me to do was to think I was really smart and, try to think my way out of my problem over and over, which I don't have to tell you is impossible. If you think your way out of it, we never would have had that help. But early on, I learned that what they call it in my industry is multimodal interventions, meaning lots of angles. And so I was in a daytime recovery group that was 100% Smart Recovery based. I also was spending my evenings in NA and AA, actually. And so those sort of hitting it from those two angles was really important in my story. Now, I know these things aren't for everybody. And if we had hours together, Luke, I would certainly call out the less awesome parts of both those groups, because that exists.
Yeah.
But I don't know what it is about my exact story, but I had kind of hit the best of all those worlds.
I'm glad to hear that. And you're listening to the Smart Recovery podcast. We're talking with Shawn Fisk. He's a counselor in Ottawa, a place called Serenity House. And he's also talking about his lived experience in recovery. I think that is exactly right. You mentioned multiple modality. It's multiple pathways to recovery, and combinations can work, and it has to be for the person and their journey. You've talked about your journey through some of recovery. Tell me when you first heard of Smart Recovery.
So I was in a early relapse prevention program. Like many people, I like to say my plane crashed into the mountain. So that was my my real moment. Some people call that the gift of desperation. There's all sorts of words for that. And a man came up to me. I was hospitalized, of course, as many men I meet become. And he asked me how long I'd like to suffer. And, I sort of said, what are you talking about? And he said, no, I'll come back. Well, 3 days later, he came back and said, how long do you want to not only suffer, but cause all those around you to suffer too? And I kind of, my eyebrow raised up, and he said, have you ever heard of smart recovery? And I said, no, I hadn't been to any kind of mutual aid group. And so he sprung me from my hospital situation. And I joined an early relapse recovery group called the CARE program. And it was 100% smart recovery based, but it was out of the Cornwall Community Hospital Mental Health and Addiction building.
And that's in Ottawa?
No, it's just on the outskirts of Ottawa. It's a small community.
Okay.
And it's actually my hometown, where I didn't get into trouble, but where I got well. I'm one of those people who's lucky enough to have family to support me in my wellness journey. So that's where I kind of heard of it. And we started doing a lot of the smart recovery tools. So they're the handouts, the sheets, as an example, the change plan worksheet, that kind of stuff. And in my estimation, that's the real strength of smart recovery is let's start to challenge those urges, and let's start to write them out. The rationally emotive behavioral therapy piece, which I instruct at Serenity House, and that kind of stuff, that worksheet piece, that's where I started to see that and say, and to start to learn to challenge my language and challenge that real idea that if I don't give in to these behavioral or using urges, it doesn't actually get harder over time. It gets easier. That evidence-based stuff, which really, it tickled my brain coming from a sports psychology piece, thinking, well, you need evidence to illustrate your successes and find your solutions out of problems. So that's kind of where I heard of it. And to be honest, I didn't attend a smart recovery meeting after that. That was a 3-month group, and it was, again, hospital-based. I didn't attend a smart recovery meeting for about a year after that.
Okay.
And so
let me ask you, I'm sorry, I just want to make sure I don't forget to ask, is that person who came to you and talked about suffering and talked about a different way of life, really, is he still involved in smart recovery as far as you know?
He is. He's one of my mentors. And I said I like my own catchphrases. Some I steal from him. And I use them to my clients. He runs the CARE program, the smart recovery based early relapse prevention program. Periodically I go in and do a Q&A with young men and women. So they're for that group. Sometimes they're early adults, and they're a complicated group because they have not yet stacked up the negative effects to look at. Right. So that's where we don't see kids of that age stacking up with the big book and stuff like that.
They haven't done the work then, as far as you're saying, some of the challenging of their own thinking, challenging of their own ways of referring to the kinds of things they're going through. Some of it still involves denial that it's something that they want to change. But talk about then, and you've already started talking about this idea of cognitive behavioral therapy, and you mentioned motivational interviewing a few minutes ago. How did those two things play into the use of SMART and in your own life and in your professional life?
So these are concepts I was aware of, but like most men, and men in hoping to get into early recovery, we don't apply these skills to ourselves. And this is one of the things I see so commonly at work, and see in my former self, and challenge in myself now, of course, is that we know what's either okay for someone, better for someone, or we could say, Luke deserves these things, but I don't. So learning to challenge that stuff. So the motivational interviewing part that was really important to me was the way in which this original man, his name is Serge, so that's just his first name, so we're good there. He really would push on the discrepancies. So part of motivational interviewing is to challenge discrepancies in thinking. I think that's where it really locks into the CBT, and also locks into the idea of the stages of change and all these concepts that we do flesh out in smart recovery, is to look at this idea that we have discrepancies. Perfect example, I love using. I'm not powerless. I feel powerful when I use. And these are, cognitive ideas that don't actually make sense. And so when my logic, again, disclosing that I thought I was pretty intelligent at the time, when my logic didn't make sense, and I was able to kind of see that over and over in a hard C compassion kind of way, if you know what I mean. I like to say there's soft C and hard C compassion.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes challenging your discrepancies and being motivated to push yourself requires some hard C compassion, let's say. So it came into my early recovery and my professional life the same way, is that I was aware of it. I was poor at challenging myself with it. And now in my professional groups or the Smart Recovery we do, which is separate, it's at Serenity House, I run it, but it's separate from our programming. I'm also part of that group. So I challenge myself with the men in real time for the same ideas and try to point out our discrepancies. When I spoke to you before briefly about doing this, I had said one of the challenges is, we often feel melancholy about Christmas time, and maybe we're not using anymore, or we're trying not to use, or maybe like myself or yourself, we're in recovery, but that may not stop us from having compulsions. For instance, with friends or family, I may be clicking by a little too much. I may be having interrupted sleep. We might have to look at our holistic health patterns. And so that's kind of where all this played in, Luke. And maybe I can just sum up by telling you that even as a high-level athletic coach, looking at the balanced lifestyle piece, right? The HALTs, the hungry, angry, lonely, tired, stressed piece. I kind of felt like that was poppycock for sure. And I like to tell, men that consider themselves above that or not needing those things, that a lot of the key to recovery for me was learning to value myself enough to take care of myself the same way I would take care of someone else that I love or care about. And that was a really hard piece. And a lot of the motivational interviewing and the CBT even was really illuminating that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where it kind of all ties in for me.
Well, you're listening to the Smart Recovery Podcast. We're talking with Shawn Fisk. He's a counselor. He has lived experience, professional experience, practical experience, and he knows a lot about smart recovery and his own recovery. And that's what you talked about just now, Shawn, your own recovery and how you challenge yourself, how you use the principles and practices of smart recovery. Let's talk some more about the idea of incorporating smart's principles, practices in things that, behaviors, negative behaviors, not necessarily just substance use disorders. You mentioned the Christmas, the buy and the clicks and spending a lot of money. How does that work with smart recovery, and what other things can be addressed through smart recovery?
Okay, well, the answer to that, Luke, I feel like is twofold. One is that always looming idea of the chain reaction towards relapse. So maybe I'll just address that really quickly because I feel like that's less important. I'm not a fan or a subscriber to fear-based recovery. That idea, right? My addiction's going to pop out of the drawer and get me one day because it's doing push-ups and getting stronger. I'm just that is a whole mode of thinking that I think is contrary to happy life.
Right. And that's more typical, of course, the 12-step recovery. And I know exactly what you mean because there are people who stress, the fear angle, the overpowering this monster who's going to come and get you. But that's not what smart recovery is about.
I agree. I think we lived in fear enough. I can't speak for you, but in my addiction, I was in a box of fear enough. So not putting aside the idea that behaviors lead to a chain reaction of relapse, let's just talk about other behaviors then. The idea for me is the overspending, the overeating, the undereating, the lack of self-care. And my feeling is, if we're talking about just men in recovery, yet not talking about, the fear or the potential of relapse, we're talking about other behaviors that just are about having a happy life. And I offer this to myself and to men in recovery. What about just having a happy life? And so how do we apply smart recovery to that? Well, it's the consistent challenge of, and I don't mean the consistent difficulty, I mean the consistent challenging of self. So I'm a solution-focused counselor. So one of the things about that overlaps all these ideas we're talking about today is be the observer. So it's really asking to value yourself enough to pay attention to yourself and to take those times. We see that in Smart Recovery and in, of course, the 12-step program with our AM/PM check-in. So if we notice these behaviors creeping in, what do we do? And so that's the thing. My short and piece on it is, when you notice it's happening, you're able to course correct. But if you're choosing to ignore these behaviors, we know something's wrong.
Sure.
As I said to you previously, it's time to take a bit of an assessment. Another Smart Recovery tool, you don't have to pull out the paper and do it over time, but you could, is the lifestyle pie. So let's look at our whole chart just mentally for a moment and go, okay, what's going on? Well, I'm fighting with my wife. I'm not eating well. My mom's mad at me. I'm guilty that I have a blended family. My daughter's away and I don't see her I only see her for 3 days at Christmas, and I'm guilty. So I want to buy her something really, extravagant like I used to be able to do. All these kind of ideas we could wrap up. So part of it is slowing down, taking care of ourselves, especially the sleep piece. We work so much with self and with men in early recovery, the insomnia piece. If I have a mental health concern, am I taking my medication appropriately? All sorts of stuff to slow down and look at. And to me, Smart Recovery is such an amazing tool to say, let's chart it and let's look at it. So that's kind of where I feel.
Sure. It's a tool that really appeals to that part of yourself that can, once you slow down, once you take a look at it, can make changes or stop the slide, for instance. You've mentioned several times this healthy and balanced lifestyle, and that's a focus for people. How can I maintain or get to a healthier and more balanced lifestyle? But I also was curious, when we talk about these behaviors or these momentum maybe towards using substances or engaging in negative behavior, that just ties into your history. So, for instance, you are feeling guilty, and you have a blended family. And part of why perhaps you divorced is that your sex conduct, you cheated, you became very risky in what you were doing there. So that behavior, while it's not using of substances per se, it's leading to a situation where you feel hopeless or angry with yourself or really down on yourself. So, and that can happen with gambling, that can happen with overeating. When I spend too much, I don't feel great about myself. So there's all these behaviors that can kind of create this momentum toward a relapse. And I know Smart Recovery, in your experience, are there men struggling with pornography addictions or gambling or other things that, start a slide to a negative lifestyle?
Absolutely, right, unequivocally, and I call that Pitfalls, right? That's my classic reference to a video game that existed before any Smart Recovery listeners out there remember. But the thing is, when we stop in early recovery, when men stop using, they're no longer that using had a role in their life. So when they're seeking out relief without coping mechanisms, without skills, or seeking out relief, other adverse behaviors that they may have done in conjunction, and or, as I see the overspending piece, hardcore, right? That jumps up, and it's kind of like the nice little piece that you get, a little bump. It does have a payoff, as I like to say. A great example for this, and some younger listeners might indict me for this, but what a perfect example of something problematic would be Tinder. So this is an application that it's like, give me a bump, give me a bump. I feel bad about myself. I'm struggling with the holidays. Some people would say that, struggling at the holidays is just an excuse. I can see that end of the coin, but the holidays are a time, as you said, that reminds us of so many complicated things. Mm-hmm. So men start struggling with, pornography, particularly, reaching out for that immediate gratification piece. And we talk about that in Smart, progressive immediate gratification. The 12-step program talks about this a lot. I noticed you use the phrase sex conduct, and often that's something you hear there. And I really like the way the 12-step program really illustrates that sex conduct piece, because that's where our compulsions will hide if we're not shining light on them.
Right. And that's and sex conduct in that context is very little to do with physical sex. And it has to do with those feelings of inadequacy and, not being accepted and needing to be affirmed in a really extreme way. But it has very little to do with the actual physical acts of sex and intimacy. In fact, it's a failure of intimacy if it comes right down to it.
I agree. It also has almost nothing to do with the sex partner, which I would offer is why it is on one, emotionally abusive to them.
Yeah,
Using someone for personal validation is a very sad thing that continues the cycle, because I'm just a subscriber to the fact that we know we're using people when we're using them, and we don't want to feel that, and we don't want to look at that piece, back to the what I said earlier about the Carl Jung looking at the thing in the shadows piece. So we're using someone for our own validation. We know they're not important to us. We're misleading them. We're harming them. They're likely in early recovery and vulnerable if past is prologue. And so we're dealing with all these things. We don't want to look at that. I don't feel good to cope with it. I will engage in some kind of behavior that, like you had said, overspending or something, where I don't feel good when I do it, but I continue to do it. If that does cascade, yeah, there's danger of relapse there in early recovery. And I do see that a lot.
Right. Well, you talked earlier about this gentleman asking you, how long do you want to make your family suffer or make those around you suffer? I'm paraphrasing. So that's the question when you start engaging in things, let's say gambling. You lose a lot of money. All of a sudden, there's no rent money. There's no mortgage money. You spend all your time kind of on video games or looking at your phone. Well, that destroys relationships because you don't have a chance to build and stay engaged with a wife, a partner, anyone who's in your life that wants your attention. I mean, there is no substitute for time and attention that we can give others. And when that's removed, it can lead to, a manipulation of others and a bad feeling all around. So that's very well explained, Shawn. I really appreciate that. And I think our listeners will too. To go back to Tinder for a second, I'm not sure all our listeners will know what that means. And I'm not exactly sure, but it's something to do with trying to find people who will immediately engage in physical intimacy, hooking up, if you will, as opposed to trying to get to know someone. And I think you have like a couple seconds to look at someone's picture and say yes or no. And that's crazy. There's no depth there to a relationship that I see. I'll give my opinion there.
Well, when we offer to men to explore their core values and beliefs, sex relations is a good one. When men are able to look at things appropriately, they're at, say, Serenity House, or they're in a group or whatever they're doing to build their solutions, they look at their what they truly want. And it often is not things like that immediate gratification. The answer to that question always for me, when guys say, should I go to meetings? Should I do this? Should I do that? It's about finding out what their belief is and attempting to the best of their ability to live according to that belief. So the answer becomes, should I use Tinder? Well, if you don't believe in it, you ought not to use it. Or should I go to 12? That's right. If it's not one of your values, should I go to 12-step meetings? Well, it's not for me to decide that, but I could advise, if you believe you should be going and aren't, that's a problem.
Right. So you're not living according to your values or your belief system or those things that you say to others that, you want in your life. And it's a lot of that self-talk, you talked about with making sure that you're not labeling yourself or you're not putting yourself in a box. It used to be a fear box. Now it could be a box. And I hear this from people in smart recovery. They don't want to be labeled as an addict or an alcoholic or someone who's powerless. Now, whether you think that is a problem or not, maybe you're in a 12-step program and that doesn't seem like a problem, and maybe even be a badge of honor because you're a recovering alcoholic and a recovering addict. But for someone who feels judged like that, smart recovery is a great answer.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I've had, as I'm sure you have had, 1 million discussions about the differences and the strengths and weaknesses of each organization. I don't see them as opposed to each other. And to Smart Recovery's credit, especially as I was becoming a Smart Recovery instructor and reading quite a bit about the program, to its credit, it says, go to whatever groups you like. We don't manage the spiritual part, so we advise, if that's what you'd like, to also engage in, for instance, the 12-step. Quickly on the piece of labels. I ask the men without fail as they come through the group a few things. I ask them about the disease model. Do you or don't you have a disease, and why or why is not important to you? And for some men, this is really important. The labels, I will say, understanding the 12-step program at its heart a bit, the idea of self-labeling is to express that, the we for them, which often men will say, this is a we program. I fundamentally disagree with that. We meant this is the first 100 men and women that recovered, and we are telling you, and if you want to join the we, you ought to do our program, being an old school thumper like I was. But what I can say about the labels is that it is an expression of joy over having a collective solution. And that's where the label came from. And I think if people are able to and wanting to do that, that's a really wonderful and powerful thing.
Is that belonging, Shawn? I mean, that's
I
a
agree.
sense of belonging.
I agree. And that's something that the 12-step program, I think, has that Smart Recovery may not have for some people, that brother and sisterhood, almost a fraternity type feeling that sometimes, myself included, like if we need to feel, because the same man that told me, to ask me if I wanted to stop suffering offered me something else that I tell every man without a fail and every woman I meet, hoping to manage these compulsions or substance abuse disorder, concurrent disorders. You are not the sum of all of the crappy things that you have done. And there's something about the 12-step program that helps you feel that way. And perhaps, and I don't know, I'm not much of a self-labeler either, but for some, that self-labeling in group, in moment, allows freedom from judgment. And I think that is probably one of the core pieces of my recovery. And I see many men and women find such freedom from self-indictment, and they can break that cycle of, I don't want to look at it, I use, because I don't want to look at what I can't look at, because I am not worthy or I am lesser. And that stigma piece too. And so the labeling thing, not to sideline the conversation to that, but it's something I feel strongly about, because it's all about perspective, right? And if there's empowerment, as in terms of clients or, sponsorship or smart recovery facilitation, we don't empower people. I don't give something to someone. Now, I know the 12-step program will say you can give something away, but recovery is truly a personal thing from my perspective. That's all to say that if something empowers someone, then more power to you, to sound cheeky, but it's an important thing. So, but that is all to say that Smart Recovery says we don't have to label, but also will allow you to. Smart Recovery is very broad, and it's it's not as rigid as some other mutual aid style groups. It really says, whatever you need.
You are, hopefully you need the Smart Recovery podcast in your life. And we're talking with Shawn Fisk, and he's a counselor at Serenity House in Ottawa. Shawn, we're going to have to wrap up here in just a few minutes, but you just mentioned the broadness of recovery for Smart Recovery. And I think that's a real differentiator for Smart Recovery. You may be sitting at a meeting and the person next to you has never been a problem drinker or drug user, has never been a compulsive gambler, but may have other issues that you can relate to in a mutually supportive way because you're trying to address them in a certain way. So that's where I think Smart Recovery, the broadness there, can be a real help for some people who don't want to feel judged, who want to talk about what's happening with them, but doesn't want to only talk to people who are struggling in the same way as them.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I think most people listening would understand that the conversation about what behavior, what type of drug, whether it's a drug or not, what mix of adverse behaviors, when we realize that early on, the actual labeling of what the problem is becomes less important, right? So yeah, we can all relate because we are struggling with behaviors that we know are part of the, we're architects of our destruction or are not feeling well or whatever it might be. We know that we are struggling to change these behaviors, and we are in a group of people hoping to change these behaviors through similar ideas. And there's a certain empowerment there because it moves us away from the minutia of the details. I am an ex-addict. I only use this. You only use that. And it also says, this is how we are different. Where for me, I like to say, this is how we are the same, because there is a feeling of community there.
Well, you don't want to compare yourself and then decide that you don't belong there because other people were arrested 5 times and other people lost, 15 jobs. But that brings around the labeling and the kind of broadness. One issue for smart recovery is also the acceptance of medication-assisted treatment. And sometimes you don't see that in other recovery programs. Do any of the gentlemen you work with or those you've worked with before use physician-prescribed medication as part of their recovery?
Yeah, and I think we're kind of touching on what we would call the harm reduction piece a little bit as well. Yes, we do have certain client load at Serenity House, a small portion of the amount of men that are there, just to keep it at a minimal, that are using prescription medications to sort of manage physical symptoms. That's more specifically seen for opiates. But we do, my experiences with that have been back and forth a bit. So, not trying to be overly careful. I'm an abstinence-based person, but I haven't had the experience where I needed to have a bridge between my use and something more safe. In my professional experiences, I've watched people go from absolute just clinging to the edge of the earth by their teeth, just barely holding on, to prescription-based interventions to rebuilding their lives. So I've seen the success of that. And that was really illuminating. I don't think I was judgmental of it because I think it's silly for someone who's had the struggles I have to look down on anyone for anything. But I didn't see those successes in my life before. So I have seen that, but I don't have personal experiences with it. I'm the kind of guy, full disclosure, that, I had sleeping meds at the beginning of I had anxiety medication at the beginning of my recovery, and it took me about 3 days to be, pouring them out onto a table and counting them and all that kind of stuff that we can all imagine. So I was just not capable of that, I think. But it's there's clearly a role for it. Our government and funding is really pushing that idea because of things like overdoses and death. And if we can present solutions to that problem in the immediate sense, sure. In my estimation, complete freedom from that may be better for some people. But again, I feel super strongly that my recovery has almost nothing to do with the next person's recovery, except that it's possible. If me, yes, you, is true. But what it means for someone else is so different.
Yeah.
So, not to sound overly vague, but I just don't have tons of experience except for professionally with that. And I've watched that be equally continually destructive and also unbelievably helpful. So I'm a 50-50 guy on it, to be honest.
Well, I like the reasoning you have, and you're explaining the reasons behind that view. But I like that. If me, why not you? Is that what you said?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, that's the acknowledgement that whatever you're going through, you have the power to change that. And Smart Recovery offers tools to help you do that. As we finish, Shawn, anything else you'd like to put out there or talk to our listeners about?
Just one of my primary messages to my clients, to friends and family, if I could, is just to say that all of these systems, Smart Recovery, the 12-step program, and frankly, a lot of the sort of self-help book ideologies, for some people, spiritual practices, they offer a fundamental piece that does overlap. And I'd like to offer that to your listeners, is that there are ways in which we can value ourselves and look after ourselves. And in doing those things, we teach the world and ourselves that we are equally worth it. And so one of the only ways, in my estimation, to get well or to pursue that kind of happy life that I just feel like everyone is meant to pursue is to always be looking about what's my goal in this behavior, and when I move towards that behavior, am I showing myself and the world that I am truthfully valuable? And to me, helping people see that they are valuable has been the great piece of my recovery and my volunteer professional work. But it also seems to hold a quality that is the key to a lot of people's wellness.
Well said, Shawn Fisk. I really appreciate the ideas and the kinds of reasoning you've brought to this podcast and your personal kind of lived experience that also informs everything that you do, everything that I do, everything that people who are in recovery and seeking that healthy and balanced life try to do. So we've been talking to Shawn Fisk. He's a counselor at Serenity House in Ottawa. Let me take a quick aside. And I love Zoom interviews for one reason, is that I can see what's in your room that you're talking from. And I see a telescope. Are you a big sky watcher?
Only more recently. I'm a firm believer that there are things in my active addiction days that I missed out on. And so every year or so, I try to get into a new small hobby. And this is where I'm at. I live out in the country in sort of southern Ontario. So I'm out in the middle of nowhere, and I've got just a wonderful blanket sky. And I never would have imagined in active addiction I'd be doing this or living here. So
right.
Yeah. The
That's
telescope
excellent.
is a new thing.
So you have your vision on faraway sites and goals that you're trying to reach. And I love that. I love that, as you said, because we're in recovery, we can get into things that we passed by or, just ignored, or opportunities that we didn't take advantage of. So that's excellent, Shawn. And I really congratulate you on that, and congratulate you and thank you for your work as a counselor. Sounds like folks, guys in Serenity House, get some real value from the kinds of things you do. So thanks, Shawn. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Luke.
You've been listening to the Smart Recovery Podcast. And if you are interested in more podcasts, you can go to smartrecovery.org. You'll find a host of good information about Smart Recovery, about the kinds of resources you can get from the various places that Smart Recovery operates, and the people that are a part of Smart Recovery. This is Luke Frazier, and until next time on the podcast, stay healthy and stay connected.
Thanks for listening to the Smart Recovery Podcast. If you found today's episode helpful and inspiring, we encourage you to share it with someone who might need to hear its messages. If you or someone you know needs addiction-related help, we encourage you to visit smartrecovery.org to find a wealth of digital resources, practical tools, and social supports meant to help you and your loved ones on their recovery journey. While there, you can search for a local Smart meeting near you, or join our online community to find 24/7 access to recovery help through regular online meetings and helpful message boards and forums. All of our meetings and online community resources are completely free of charge. Be sure to connect with us online to get more helpful addiction-related resources. Visit our website at smartrecovery.org, where you can search for local meetings, join our online community, subscribe to our e-newsletter, and find regular blogs, videos, podcasts, and more. You can also help us to spread our self-empowering, science-based messages to more people who need to hear from them in important ways. First, get trained on the Smart Recovery Program. If you are a licensed healthcare provider and could benefit from using Smart Recovery in your professional work, or if you are someone who would like to volunteer and lead Smart Recovery meetings in your community, please check out our training and volunteer opportunities at www.smartrecovery.org/training. Second, donate to support our work. Smart Recovery is a nonprofit that runs on the donations from generous supporters who understand the need for recovery-related support. If you would like to help us reach more people, consider donating to Smart Recovery at smartrecovery.org/donate. We'd like to thank US World Meds for their generous support of this episode. We'll see you next time on the next episode of the Smart Recovery Podcast.